The morning 23-year-old Elias Vance deliberately bypassed a massive 100-foot-wide crescent of prime low-lying prairie soil. The veteran farmers watching from County Road 9 could hardly believe what they were seeing. It was mid-April in the volatile plains of eastern Montana, a rugged landscape where the planting season is notoriously short, and the weather is always eager to punish the unprepared. All across the Yellowstone River basin, the frantic rush of spring was in full swing. The crisp morning air was thick with the smell of heavy diesel and freshly turned earth. Every tractor within a 20-mile radius was running at full throttle, ripping up the ground to maximize planting acreage before the narrow window closed. In this part of the country, every farmer worth their salt knew that you never, ever wasted an inch of workable, fertile ground. But there was Elias. He sat perched on the cracked leather seat of his late father's rattling vintage Massey Ferguson, a piece of machinery that looked like an antique compared to the massive GPS-guided rigs dominating the neighboring fields. As he approached the lower basin of his property, the absolute richest, darkest soil on the entire farm, he reached for the hydraulics. Instead of dropping the heavy steel plows into the earth to churn up the long stretch of tall, matted native grass, he lifted them. The heavy iron blades hovered in the air as the old Massey Ferguson crawled along the edge of the crescent. Elias steered carefully, tracing the exact border of the wild brush, leaving a massive untouched barrier of thick prairie roots. He circled the entire 100-foot span, leaving it perfectly intact, and then casually continued down the field as if he had done nothing out of the ordinary. Up on the elevated gravel of the county road, 3 older men stood leaning against the polished grill of a brand-new $1 million tractor. They had farmed this county for decades and thought they had seen it all. Hank, a veteran of 40 Montana planting seasons, pushed back his cap and scratched his head in sheer disbelief. He muttered to the others, wondering out loud what the young Vance boy was doing throwing away his best yield. Beside him, a neighboring mega-farmer chuckled. It was a cold, dry sound. He pointed out that the kid must not know what he was sitting on. In their eyes, Elias was leaving thousands of dollars of potential profit rotting in the weeds. They watched Elias park the rattling Massey Ferguson near an old, weathered barn and step down into the dirt, his face shadowed by his hat. The older men did not say it to his face, but they were all thinking the exact same thing. The Vance farm was already drowning in trouble. Elias had been carrying the crushing weight of the entire operation alone since his father passed away the previous autumn. Now, the grieving 23-year-old kid was making a rookie mistake that would surely bankrupt him before the first harvest. To them, Elias had finally cracked under the immense pressure of running a commercial farm by himself. But Elias was not cracking. He was preparing for a battle that the men on the road did not even know was coming. To the men leaning against their shiny trucks on the county road, Elias's decision to leave a massive stretch of prime soil to the wild prairie grasses looked like the foolish mistake of a broken young man. But the reality of Elias's situation was far more desperate than a simple matter of wounded pride or inexperience. This was a raw, unforgiving fight for sheer survival. Just 6 months earlier, during the bitter chill of the previous autumn, Elias's father had passed away suddenly. The loss had ripped the foundation out from under the Vance legacy, but the heartbreak was only the beginning of the nightmare. When Elias took over the farm's heavy leather ledger, he discovered a terrifying truth hidden beneath the stacks of paperwork. His father had taken out a massive agricultural bank loan to keep the operation afloat during a string of brutal seasons, and a crushing balloon payment was due by the end of the year. Modern farming is rarely just about seeds, weather, and hard work anymore. It is a high-stakes game of debt and leverage. The financial reality that Elias inherited was absolutely suffocating. Every piece of rusted equipment, every acre of fenced pasture, and every handful of grain was heavily mortgaged to corporate lenders. The math was brutal and entirely unforgiving. To satisfy the bank and save the land that had been in his family for over a century, Elias needed an absolute miracle. He had to pull off a flawless grain harvest, fighting the notoriously unpredictable Montana weather every step of the way. But grain alone would not be enough to clear the debt. The true lifeline of the Vance farm rested on the fragile shoulders of 50 vulnerable spring calves. These calves were the farm's ultimate cash crop, the only asset valuable enough to cover the looming balloon payment before the winter deadline. Raising livestock in the rugged Yellowstone River basin is an immense, high-risk gamble even for well-funded, experienced operators. A sudden late-season freeze, a predator attack, or a shortage of quality feed could wipe out the herd in a matter of days. Elias had to raise every single one of those 50 calves to a healthy selling weight. If he lost even a small fraction of the herd, or if the grain yield fell short by just a few tons, the bank executives in their pristine city offices would sign the foreclosure papers without a second thought. The tractors would be auctioned off, the cattle loaded onto transport trucks, and the farm gates padlocked forever. When you understand the ticking clock of debt hanging over Elias's head, his actions in the lower basin seem even more absurd to an outsider. Abandoning the most fertile 100-foot crescent of land looked like pure financial suicide. He was actively throwing away guaranteed grain yield when he needed every single penny just to keep the bank at bay. The neighboring farmers assumed he was paralyzed by the impossible weight of the impending foreclosure, making irrational choices as his world collapsed around him. But what they failed to realize was that Elias Vance was not surrendering. He was playing a deeply calculated, strategic game of survival that none of the modern, technology-obsessed farmers around him could possibly comprehend. The origins of Elias's bizarre strategy did not come from a modern agricultural seminar, a corporate agronomist, or a high-tech farming app. It came from the bitter, freezing darkness of the previous winter. Months before the tractors ever hit the fields, Elias had spent his evenings huddled in the freezing, drafty attic of the old farmhouse. Surrounded by boxes of dusty financial records, he had been desperately searching for anything, a misplaced land deed, an old equipment title, that might give him leverage with the bank. Instead, buried beneath a stack of heavy, moldering tax ledgers, his hands brushed against something completely different, a water-stained, leather-bound journal. The crumbling pages belonged to his great-grandfather, Arthur Vance. Arthur was a farmer forged in absolute hardship. He had successfully kept the family operation alive through the catastrophic, landscape-destroying drought of the 1930s Dust Bowl. A decade later, he had battled the legendary, devastating Yellowstone Basin floods of the 1940s. He was a survivor who understood that out on the volatile Montana plains, nature always had the final say. As Elias carefully turned the brittle, yellowed pages by the light of a single bulb, he realized he was not reading a simple diary. He was reading a masterclass in agricultural survival. Arthur had meticulously documented how the land behaved when extreme weather struck, leaving behind detailed diagrams and field notes that modern chemical-driven farming had long since forgotten. In the middle of the journal, Elias found a precise, hand-drawn sketch of the lower basin, the exact same field that served as the lifeline of his current operation. Beside it, written in bold, faded ink, was a strict warning. His great-grandfather had mapped out a defensive technique using contour swales and what he called buffer crescents. The handwritten instructions were absolute. Never, under any circumstances, plow the lowest edge of the basin near the waterline. Instead, leave a massive, unbroken barrier of deep-rooted native prairie grass completely untouched. The old man explained the science of the plains in incredibly simple, powerful terms. Modern, aggressive plows chop up the soil, leaving it loose, airy, and entirely defenseless. But native prairie grass is different. It grows thick, aggressive roots that plunge several feet deep into the dark earth. The journal described these thick, ancient roots as a hidden network of subterranean steel cables. When the violent spring meltwater inevitably comes roaring down from the mountains and surges across the flatlands, freshly plowed dirt instantly turns to liquid mud. It washes away in minutes, taking seeds, expensive fertilizers, and the farmer's entire livelihood with it. But a thick crescent of native grass stands firm against the current. The deep roots lock the earth together, forming an unbreakable, natural wall. This buffer acts like a giant sponge in a break, slowing the raging water down, trapping the heavy sediment, and protecting everything that sits behind it. Sitting in the freezing, silent attic, Elias realized the profound truth. His great-grandfather had left him a historical blueprint to outsmart the river itself. The massive, unplowed crescent was never a mistake. It was an ancient, calculated shield. To make his great-grandfather's blueprint work, Elias knew he had to push all his chips to the center of the table. He could not afford half measures. Modern farming logic dictated that if you sacrifice a massive chunk of your best planting acreage, you must pump the remaining soil full of expensive, synthetic chemical fertilizers to force a higher yield. That was the standard playbook used by every massive operation in the county. But Elias rejected the modern way. Every dollar spent on chemical inputs was a dollar he did not have, pushing him closer to the bank's foreclosure deadline. Instead of relying on laboratory-made solutions, he decided to double down on the raw, natural resilience of the land itself. He walked out to the main equipment shed and hooked up his father's heavy-duty Schuler 2000 feed wagon to the tractor. The Schuler 2000 was a massive, rugged piece of steel machinery, typically used for mixing and distributing heavy feed to large herds of cattle. It was not meant for delicate crop work. But Elias had a different purpose for the hulking machine. He spent days manually loading the massive steel tub with tons of rich, dark organic compost that had been breaking down in the back pens for years. This compost was packed with natural nutrients and healthy microbes, creating a thick, heavy biological glue. With the Schuler 2000 roaring behind him, Elias meticulously drove along the elevated ridges just above the unplowed crescent of native prairie grass. The heavy-duty augers inside the wagon ground the dense compost, dispensing a thick, protective layer of organic armor along the buffer line. He was deliberately feeding the wild grass, fortifying the soil structure, and ensuring those deep, subterranean roots grew as strong and thick as possible to hold the earth together. It was a slow, punishing process. The massive equipment required constant attention, and the uneven terrain of the lower basin meant Elias had to fight the heavy steering wheel for every single inch. The physical toll on a solo operator was absolutely grueling. Elias worked from the first pale light of dawn until the stars filled the freezing Montana sky. His muscles ached, his hands were blistered from the heavy iron levers, and his lungs burned from the thick dirt in the air. But heavier than the physical exhaustion was the profound, crushing loneliness of his gamble. Across the valley, the massive corporate operations were running their sleek air-conditioned tractors around the clock, using satellite guidance to inject perfect streams of synthetic chemicals into their completely flattened fields. They were following the established, proven rules of modern agriculture. Elias was completely alone, wrestling with heavy steel and raw compost in the dirt. He was staking the entire future of the Vance legacy, the survival of his livestock, and his own financial survival on a rusted feed wagon and the faded handwriting of a dead man. When the doubts crept into his mind during the silent, freezing nights, the isolation felt suffocating. There was no one to consult, no one to share the burden of the massive debt, and absolutely no safety net if he failed. He only had the leather journal, the heavy-duty Schuler, and a desperate hope that his great-grandfather's old-school wisdom was stronger than the modern methods surrounding him. The local county tractor auction is not just a place to buy and sell heavy machinery, it is the beating heart of agricultural gossip. In late April, with his cash reserves completely dry, Elias Vance drove his truck into the crowded dirt lot of the auction house. He had hauled an old, surplus hay baler to put on the auction block. He desperately needed the capital. The 50 spring calves required high-quality feed to survive the unpredictable weeks ahead, and feed required money the bank refused to lend him. The air was thick with the smell of engine grease and pulverized dirt, vibrating with the rapid-fire chant of the auctioneer echoing over the loudspeakers. It was a harsh, unforgiving environment where a farmer's financial struggles were always put on public display. Elias stood quietly near the back of the crowd, a solitary figure amidst a sea of seasoned farmers holding steaming cups of black coffee. In rural farming communities, news travels faster than a prairie fire, and blood in the water always draws a crowd. As he waited for his baler to roll up to the block, Elias could hear the low, harsh whispers carrying over the steady hum of diesel engines. A group of men standing by a concession trailer were openly discussing the Vance farm. They were not offering sympathy for the grieving son. They were running the brutal math of his impending failure. Elias stood completely still as he overheard two men placing actual wagers on which month the bank would finally lock the gates and seize his cattle. The murmurs suddenly quieted down as the biggest landowner in the county stepped through the crowd. His name was Warren Sterling, a man who viewed farming not as a partnership with the land, but as an industrial conquest. Sterling was infamous for his aggressive modern methods, using heavy bulldozers to drastically grade and flatten his acreage while relying completely on massive doses of synthetic chemicals to force his crops to grow. He stepped up to Elias, his expensive boots entirely free of mud, looking down at the young man with a look of manufactured pity. Sterling knew exactly how much debt Elias was carrying, and he saw the unplowed lower basin as the final proof that the Vance family operation was finished. Sterling did not bother with polite pleasantries. He leaned in and offered to buy the Vance farm right there on the spot for pennies on the dollar. He masked his corporate greed as a neighborly favor, telling Elias that taking the lowball cash offer would save him the extreme public embarrassment of a massive bank foreclosure. It was a calculated, ruthless move designed to break a young man who was already pushed to the absolute edge. But Elias did not break. He thought of his great-grandfather's journal and the heavy organic soil he had spent weeks preparing. Elias looked Sterling dead in the eye. He did not raise his voice and he did not argue. He simply shook his head in a silent, absolute refusal, turned his back on the wealthiest man in the county, and walked away into the dust, leaving the whispers far behind him. May finally broke across the Montana plains, bringing with it the most delicate and high-stakes period of the agricultural calendar, calving season. For a livestock operation on the brink of financial collapse, this was the absolute moment of truth. Over the course of a few exhausting weeks, Elias's 50 calves were safely delivered into the world. They were small, fragile, and deeply vulnerable, representing the entire future of the Vance legacy. If they survived the spring and grew to a healthy selling weight, Elias could satisfy the crushing bank loan. If they perished, the farm was lost forever. Elias moved the newborn herd to the lower pasture, an area rich in fresh spring grass that sat directly above the massive 100-foot-wide unplowed crescent he had so carefully maintained. For a fleeting moment, as the calves grazed peacefully under the pale blue sky, it seemed like the massive gamble might just pay off. But out on the rugged plains of the Yellowstone Basin, peace is always temporary. In the second week of May, the atmosphere drastically shifted. The crisp, predictable spring air suddenly turned thick, heavy, and unusually hot. An intense, unseasonal heat wave swept across the valley floor, completely suffocating the landscape. Under normal circumstances, farmers welcomed the warmth to kickstart their planted grain. But this heat was a terrifying warning sign. Up in the towering peaks of the distant mountains, an unprecedented late-spring blizzard had just laid down feet of dense, heavy snow. Now, under the sudden, scorching temperatures, that massive snowpack was melting at an alarming, unnatural speed. Millions of gallons of ice-cold water began rushing down the steep mountain slopes, filling the creeks and tributaries that fed directly into the Yellowstone River. Then, the final devastating piece of the weather puzzle locked into place. The sky turned the color of bruised iron as a dark, slow-moving low-pressure system stalled directly over the basin. The National Weather Service crackled over the emergency radio, issuing an urgent, ominous warning to the entire region. The dark storm system was not just carrying rain. It was preparing to dump inches of continuous heavy downpours directly on top of the already melting mountain snowpack. It was the perfect, catastrophic recipe for an absolute disaster. The radio announcer's voice was grim, warning that the river gauge at the upper basin was already rising at a terrifying rate. The Yellowstone River was about to experience a historic, violent surge, pushing water levels far beyond anything the modern agricultural operations had planned for. Elias stood on his front porch, feeling the heavy electric drop in air pressure as the first freezing drops of rain hit the dry dirt. He looked down toward the lower pasture, where his 50 fragile calves were huddled near the grass buffer. The ticking clock of his bank debt no longer mattered. A colossal wall of muddy, surging water was coming, and his great-grandfather's old, unplowed crescent was the only thing standing between the newborn herd and total destruction. The storm did not arrive with a gentle warning. It hit the eastern Montana plains like a massive freight train. In the dead of night, the heavy sky completely shattered, unleashing a relentless, pounding rain that sounded like handfuls of sharp gravel being aggressively thrown against the old farmhouse roof. The wind howled through the yard, violently rattling the window panes and pushing the freezing water sideways. In the suffocating darkness, the air smelled intensely of wet, heavy clay and crushed sagebrush. But beneath the chaotic, deafening drumming of the downpour, a much more terrifying noise began to build. It was a deep, guttural roar echoing up from the valley floor. The Yellowstone River, heavily swollen by the rapid mountain snowmelt and the unending storm, was violently tearing at its banks. Across the county, sheer panic rapidly set in. Flashes of lightning illuminated a frantic, desperate scramble. The men who had mocked Elias were now fighting a terrifying, losing battle against the deep mud. Bright halogen tractor lights sliced through the thick sheets of rain as neighbors desperately tried to move their expensive, heavy machinery to higher ground. Massive diesel engines roared and loudly strained, their huge tires spinning uselessly, sinking deep into the rapidly liquefying soil. The perfectly graded, completely flat fields they were so incredibly proud of were now dangerous traps of deep, sinking sludge. The county emergency sirens wailed in the distance, barely audible over the raging wind, signaling that the main access roads were already washing out. The farmers were trapped in the dark, watching helplessly as the rising floodwaters began to swallow their planted grain. Elias Vance did not start a tractor. He did not run out into the mud to frantically move equipment. He stood perfectly still on his wooden porch, staring into the pitch-black night. A blinding flash of lightning revealed the terrifying reality of the lower valley. A colossal wall of muddy, violent water had completely breached the riverbanks and was surging rapidly across the open plains. It was a churning, aggressive mass of destructive energy, moving with terrifying speed directly toward his property. His eyes immediately locked onto the lower pasture. He could barely make out the small, dark shapes of his 50 young calves, huddled tightly together in the freezing rain, entirely defenseless against the approaching tide. The roaring mass of dark, freezing water swallowed the neighboring lower fields and raced up the incline toward the Vance farm. It was moving so incredibly fast that it seemed impossible anything could survive its brutal impact. The crushing weight of the bank loan, the harsh whispers at the tractor auction, and the physical exhaustion of the past month all faded into the background. There was nothing left to do. No machinery left to start, and no desperate last-minute plan left to execute. Elias tightly gripped the wooden railing of the porch, holding his breath as the violent surge rapidly approached the edge of his unplowed boundary. The ultimate test had finally arrived. He could only stand in the cold and wait to see if his great-grandfather's forgotten science could truly hold up against the unstoppable fury of nature. The violent, churning wall of muddy floodwater roared across the valley floor, swallowing everything in its absolute path. It carried broken tree limbs, heavy debris, and the raw, unstoppable energy of the swollen Yellowstone River. As Elias watched from his porch through the driving rain, the massive surge finally slammed into the lower edge of the Vance farm. On the neighboring properties, the exact same wave had just hit freshly plowed, perfectly flat fields. Because those fields had been aggressively chopped up and loosened by modern machinery, they offered absolutely zero physical resistance. The loose, airy dirt immediately liquefied, turning into a fast-moving, destructive slurry that completely washed away expensive seeds and deep layers of precious topsoil. But on Elias's land, the violent water hit something entirely different. It violently slammed directly into the massive 100-foot-wide crescent of unplowed native prairie grass and the heavy compost swales Elias had meticulously built. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, the muddy water surged upward, looking as if it might easily overwhelm the barrier. But then, the ancient physics of the rugged Montana plains took over. Beneath the surface, millions of thick, deeply rooted prairie stems acted exactly like the subterranean steel cables Elias's great-grandfather had described in his weathered journal. The incredibly dense, unbroken wall of wild vegetation acted as a colossal, natural break. Instead of easily tearing through the earth, the massive surge of water was forced to forcefully fight against the deeply anchored grass. In incredibly simple terms, the sheer kinetic energy of the flood was rapidly drained away. Without the extreme speed to push straight up the incline, the raging water lost its aggressive momentum. Unable to charge directly up the slope toward the huddled herd of newborn calves, the floodwaters were forced to rapidly spread out sideways, moving harmlessly along the deep contour swales Elias had prepared. The thick, matted roots grabbed the heavy, suffocating river silt that the flash flood had been carrying down from the mountains. This pale, heavy silt was incredibly destructive. It was the exact same sediment that was currently burying the neighboring fields under a solid layer of suffocating mud. But in Elias's lower basin, the native grass simply swallowed the heavy dirt. The tall prairie stems trapped the dense sediment, forcing it to drop harmlessly out of the fast current and packed tightly into the wild barrier. The violently churning water was naturally filtered and dramatically slowed before it could ever reach the delicate planted grain or the lower pasture. The colossal wave that had promised absolute destruction was rapidly reduced to a slow, shallow creep. Elias stood completely frozen, his heart pounding intensely in his chest as the lightning flashed across the sky once more. The terrifying surge had completely stopped just a short distance away from the frightened herd. The 50 vulnerable spring calves were standing in wet grass, but they were entirely safe from the dangerous, rushing current. The freshly planted grain sitting higher up the slope remained perfectly untouched. The forgotten old-school wisdom pulled from a dusty, freezing attic had stood up to the absolute worst fury that nature could throw at it. The massive, unplowed crescent had completely broken the back of the flood, saving the entire farm in a single profound victory. When the heavy dark clouds finally broke and the pale light of morning crept across the Montana plains, the true devastating scale of the destruction became incredibly clear. The storm had passed, but it left behind a completely transformed, ruined landscape. A chilling silence hung heavily over the Yellowstone River basin, broken only by the low, steady rush of the still-swollen river. As the sun slowly illuminated the valley floor, it revealed a heartbreaking scene of contrasting fortunes. For the veteran farmers who had leaned against their expensive trucks and laughed at Elias Vance just a few weeks prior, the morning light brought absolute disaster. Their perfectly flat, heavily graded and chemically treated fields had been completely obliterated. Because they had aggressively plowed every single inch of available earth, leaving absolutely zero natural resistance. The violent floodwaters had aggressively stripped away hundreds of acres of expensive, nutrient-rich topsoil. The loose dirt was completely gone, washed away into the churning river. What remained was utterly suffocating. A thick, heavy layer of pale river silt, resembling wet concrete, blanketed their massive properties. This dense silt would rapidly harden under the sun, effectively suffocating any seeds that managed to survive the washout and requiring weeks of incredibly expensive heavy machinery remediation just to break it apart. Worse still, emergency sirens wailed in the far distance as several large operations frantically scrambled to recover livestock that had been tragically swept away by the sudden, unobstructed surge. Then the focus shifted to the property lines of the Vance farm. From the elevated gravel of the county road, the difference was absolutely stark and undeniable. While the neighboring land was a desolate, muddy wasteland, Elias's property was completely intact. The violent, destructive water line had stopped exactly at the lower boundary of the massive, unplowed crescent. The thick, matted native prairie grass was heavily battered and choked with trapped river silt, but it had held the line perfectly. The deep, subterranean roots had refused to break. Just beyond the protective wild buffer, Elias's freshly planted grain fields sloped gently upward, perfectly green and entirely undisturbed by the rushing current. In the lower pasture, exactly where Elias had placed them, the 50 vulnerable spring calves were calmly grazing in the cool morning air. They were completely safe. The deep mud had never reached them. Elias walked slowly down the incline, his heavy boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and placed his hand against the tall, wild grass. The massive gamble had worked. Because his livestock had survived the night, the impending, crushing balloon payment to the bank was no longer a terrifying death sentence. His assets were secure, his land was whole, and the incredible weight of his massive debt suddenly felt manageable. He had not just survived the storm, he had completely outsmarted it. Over the next 7 days, the heavy, chaotic energy of the Yellowstone River basin slowly settled into a grim, exhausting reality. The loud, confident talk at the local county supply stores completely vanished. Instead, a quiet, heavy atmosphere took over the entire farming community. The stark, undeniable contrast between the ruined, mud-soaked fields of the wealthy operations and the perfectly intact, green slopes of the Vance farm was absolutely impossible to ignore. Word spread quickly across the dirt roads. The young kid they had all assumed was going completely bankrupt had somehow built an unbreakable fortress out of wild grass, while their million-dollar technology and modern methods had failed them entirely. They did not come in a large, loud group, and they certainly did not come with grand, formal apologies. That is not how proud men operate on the rugged plains. They arrived one by one, slowly driving their heavy pickup trucks up Elias's long gravel driveway. These were the exact same veteran farmers who had leaned against their polished rigs and laughed at his unplowed lower basin just weeks prior. Now they stepped out of their cabs as exhausted, defeated men. Their heavy work boots were thickly coated in the pale, concrete-like river silt that had ruined their livelihoods. They stood quietly in the yard, looking deeply tired, seeking crucial answers they simply could not find in their modern agricultural manuals. The most surprising visit came late on a Thursday afternoon. Warren Sterling, the wealthy landowner who had ruthlessly tried to buy Elias out at the tractor auction, pulled his truck to the edge of the lower pasture. Sterling did not march up to the farmhouse porch. Instead, he walked slowly down to the massive 100-foot-wide crescent of native prairie grass. He stood there for a very long time in absolute silence. He stared intently at the perfect, sharp line in the dirt where the brutal destruction of the floodwaters had completely stopped, halted by the thick, wild roots. The sheer physics of the survival baffled him. When Elias finally walked down the hill to meet him, Sterling did not offer his usual arrogant smirk. He just looked at the young man and simply asked how he knew the wild brush would hold the raging water back. Elias could have easily thrown Sterling's harsh words right back at him. He could have gloated about his massive victory and the survival of his calves. But there was absolutely no spite or arrogance in Elias. He understood that the plains were entirely unforgiving, and survival was a tough, shared battle. Without a word of anger, Elias reached into his heavy jacket pocket and pulled out his great-grandfather's water-stained, leather-bound journal. He gently opened the brittle, yellowed pages and showed the older men the detailed, hand-drawn diagrams of the contour swales and buffer crescents. He explained the incredibly simple old-school science of deep prairie roots and natural resistance. He shared the forgotten wisdom of a man who had survived the worst disasters of the past century, freely offering the crucial knowledge to the exact men who had mocked him, so they could finally start rebuilding their own ruined land. When the heavy winter snows finally melted and gave way to the following spring, the rugged landscape of the Yellowstone River Basin looked fundamentally different than it had in decades. The arrogant, completely flat, heavily graded expanses of bare dirt that once proudly dominated the county were largely gone. In their place, carefully tracing the winding, unpredictable edges of the river and the lower basins, massive, unbroken crescents of native prairie grass stood tall against the wind. Several of the wealthiest, largest commercial operations in the region, including Warren Sterling's massive acreage, had quietly abandoned their stubborn reliance on synthetic perfection. They had pulled back their heavy, deep-cutting plows and established thick, organic buffer zones of their own. The devastating flash flood had taught the entire farming community a brutal, unforgettable lesson. It proved, with absolute certainty, the sheer arrogance of assuming that modern chemical-driven technology will always triumph over the raw, terrifying power of nature. They had finally understood the true meaning of land stewardship. They realized that working alongside the ancient rhythms of the earth, respecting its natural boundaries, is far more powerful and sustainable than trying to aggressively conquer it with giant machines. For Elias Vance, the arrival of the new spring planting season carried a deeply profound sense of quiet, hard-earned victory. He was no longer the exhausted, grieving kid drowning under the impossible weight of a looming bank foreclosure and the harsh whispers of his neighbors. The 50 fragile spring calves had not only survived the catastrophic flood, but they had thrived on the rich, untouched grass of the lower pasture. When the autumn livestock auctions finally rolled around, Elias had driven his healthy, fully grown herd to the market and secured a massive, premium price. With that crucial capital in hand, he had proudly walked into the sterile, corporate office of the agricultural bank and handed over the exact sum of the massive balloon payment. He walked out of those heavy glass doors with the official title to his family's land completely clear, finally breaking the suffocating chain of modern commercial debt. On a cool, quiet morning before firing up the old rattling Massey Ferguson tractor, Elias sat alone on the wooden porch of the farmhouse. The rising sun cast a warm, golden light across the newly fortified, perfectly green lower basin. He held his great-grandfather's water-stained, leather-bound journal in his rough, calloused hands, carefully turning the pages. The brittle paper was a testament to pure resilience, written by a man who had faced the absolute worst of the unforgiving Montana environment. As Elias traced the faded, handwritten ink of the contour diagrams, a deep realization settled into his chest. He had not just successfully protected his livestock and saved his family's farm from a ruthless financial system. He had accomplished something far more enduring. He had resurrected a forgotten, incredibly vital piece of generational knowledge that the land desperately required to survive. He had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the ghosts of the past still have crucial life-saving lessons to teach the modern agricultural world, as long as there is someone willing to simply stop, listen, and leave a piece of the wild earth completely unbroken. If you believe that old-school wisdom can still beat modern greed, hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like to help us share more incredible farming stories, and leave a comment below about the best advice your grandparents ever gave you.